Today, direct air capture to sequestration is a necessary complement to SAF, allowing us to address unavoidable residual emissions. Even if we went to 100% SAF, we wouldn't be at net zero. There's still residual emissions from SAF. So it's that complementary two sides of the same coin piece. We're investing in the infrastructure we need to grow that future feedstock for SAF. And it can help us, really interestingly, to accelerate our decarbonization timelines, particularly in regions where SAF is scarce.
Welcome to Sustainability in the Air, the world's first podcast dedicated to sustainable aviation. I'm your host, Shashank Nigam, the CEO of Simplifying. Every Thursday, I have important conversations with top aviation executives, technology entrepreneurs, and policymakers helping aviation take climate action. Conversations that help separate the signal from the noise. Whether you are a frequent flyer or an airline executive, if you care about sustainability or simply love traveling, welcome aboard. My guest today is Anna Stukas. Anna, a fellow Canadian, is the VP of Strategic Partnerships at 1PointFive. Prior to 1PointFive, Anna spent nearly 10 years with Carbon Engineering, a leading direct air capture developer based in Squamish, British Columbia, not too far from where I used to live in Whistler. And this was recently acquired by Oxy Low Carbon Ventures specifically. Both 1PointFive and Carbon Engineering are subsidiaries of Oxy, allowing 1PointFive to deploy facilities that use carbon engineering technology and scale rapidly, not just in aviation, but in the larger direct air capture play. Anna and I talk about strategic partnerships at 1PointFive and how direct air capture can help aviation become more sustainable. Please enjoy this interview. Anna, great to have you on the podcast. I believe you've been working on carbon capture since 2015. Tell us a little about what you do at 1PointFive and how's the journey been?
So if we take a step back, major assessments on how to avoid the worst impacts of climate change, including those from the IPCC, conclude that limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees is going to require billions of tons of carbon dioxide removal alongside accelerated emission reduction. That means that in addition to preventing carbon from going into the air in the first place, we also need to deal with some of the carbon that's already there, some of the carbon that we aren't going to be able to avoid by pulling it out of the air. What direct air capture is a technology that captures the carbon out of the air directly using an engineered system. It does this by pulling in atmospheric air, and then through a series of chemical reactions, we extract the carbon dioxide while returning the rest of the air back to the environment. This is the same thing that plants and trees do every day as they photosynthesize. It's also how we keep astronauts alive on the space station. This is something we've been doing for decades. The difference with direct air capture is that it does it much more quickly and with a smaller land footprint than trees. And what's been really critical in terms of the commercialization journey is figuring out how to scale up direct air capture to climate relevant scale. So being able to remove those billions of tons of carbon from the atmosphere. Really importantly, when we pull that carbon out of the air and we store it deep underground, it stays there on geological timescales, so millennia. I could go into the details and nerd out with you a little bit.
We are all about nerding out on this show, so please go ahead.
But so basically, imagine a giant industrial cooling tower, like the kind that you see in major air conditioning units or on the top of the building, but then make it bigger. And that's basically where our process starts. We call it an air contactor, but it's a modified industrial cooling tower. We then use giant fans to pull air into that structure where it passes across thin plastic surfaces that have our capture solution flowing over them. The solution then chemically binds with the carbon dioxide molecules, taking you back to high school chemistry. It's an acid-base reaction. So an acid plus a base makes water plus a salt. That allows us to pull the carbon dioxide out of the air, traps them in a liquid solution as a carbonate salt. The carbon dioxide contained in that carbonate solution then goes through a series of chemical processes to increase its concentration, to purify it, and to compress it so that it can be delivered in a gaseous form, ready for use. So you could take that carbon dioxide, combine it with clean hydrogen, and turn it into sustainable aviation fuel, or for storage. So you could compress it until it's what's called a supercritical liquid. That's a gas that behaves like a liquid, and then store it deep underground.
So tell me, this is, carbon capture versus carbon capture and storage versus carbon capture and conversion to jet fuel. Are there merits to doing one or the other? Why can't we just take all the carbon and just store it?
So we need to do all of the above. And it's also important to note that often when we hear the term carbon capture, we think about capturing carbon from a flue stack or a point source before it goes into the air. Whereas when we're doing direct air capture, it's a type of carbon capture that's specifically pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere. We could just take all that carbon out of the air and put it deep underground. What experts tell us is that it's critically important that we implement all of the ways that we can reduce emissions as well as taking the carbon out of the atmosphere and storing it deep underground. This is not a get out of jail free card. This doesn't let us continue business as usual and not also do all of those other pieces of emissions reductions that are really critical. And when we think about this in an aviation context, aviation is one of the hardest industries to decarbonize. The energy density of liquid-based fuels is really hard to beat. We're probably a long way away from long-haul electrification and hydrogen airplanes, although I'm sure many of your other podcast guests can speak to that far more than I can. But even as we do all of those other things, as we improve operational efficiencies, go to more efficient airplanes, implement sustainable aviation fuel, there are still going to be residual emissions that we need to tackle. And direct air capture can be a really powerful tool to allow us to address those residual emissions. One of the fundamental benefits of a DAC technology is it can be used to address any carbon dioxide emission from any location and any point in time, regardless of the source of emission. So rather than trying to strap elaborate carbon capture machines on the back of aeroplanes, which just doesn't work from a physics perspective, we can centralize that capture in a place where it makes sense, where we can do it economically. And that is a critical component when you think about all the moving pieces in the aviation industry, all of the infrastructure that goes to keep the world connected. So DAC can really, and DAC is direct air capture, can complement our emissions reductions efforts. It can offer a really practical and scalable and cost-effective pathway to help us to get to net zero. And while we're investing in carbon removals today, it's helping us to grow a future feedstock for sustainable aviation fuel tomorrow.
There's so much to dive into that and unpack here. So, and I want to touch on multiple issues. One is, you mentioned the get out of jail card, you mentioned cost effectiveness, and you mentioned scalability. So let's touch upon the first one. You mentioned this is not a get out of jail card. Yet, a lot of lobbying that has happened for direct air capture is from oil companies. You now are owned by Oxy as well. Why do you say that this is not a get out of jail card? Doesn't this give the license to oil companies to continue drilling because, hey, we are capturing carbon on the other side?
I think it's really important to think about this in terms of a couple different things. So first of all, this isn't free. This costs money to do. It takes energy to do. And it costs substantially more than business as usual. And so there's that piece that says this isn't something that you would do unless there are things like climate policies and regulations and social pressure that are creating that imperative to not only reduce emissions but also address residuals. When it comes to participation by the energy industry, I think it's really important for us to think about, you know, when we're looking at how we put CO2 safely and securely deep underground, the people with the best knowledge and know-how to do that are the ones who've been taking oil out of the ground. They have the best understanding of the subsurface. And in the case of our parent company, they've actually been putting carbon dioxide underground for over 50 years already. And so when we were at Carbon Engineering, our carbon engineering's core expertise is how you get the CO2 out of the air and how you concentrate it. We didn't have the expertise in how you put it safely and securely deep underground. And so finding a partner that brought that expertise to the table was absolutely critical for us. And we've found a partner like that in the form of Oxy. And I think it's also really notable that this is a company that's investing billions of dollars in growing this critical infrastructure, that our CEO on our quarterly updates talks about the growth and the plans for our carbon management business as being a significant part of a go forward plan. So I think it's an incredible opportunity actually for the energy industry to participate in a meaningful way toward solving the effects of climate change.
I want to dive a little deeper if you're open to this on the topic. If I look at the statistics, yes, in general, big oil is investing more in sustainable technologies like direct air capture. If you look at just the quantum amount, the amount is increasing. But as a percentage of revenues or as a percentage of profits, it's continuing to be the same or going down. For Oxy or for 1.5, is that number growing? Is it just the absolute amount of investment that's growing, or is the percentage of revenue or profits invested in sustainability solutions like that growing as well?
I can't speak to exactly the percentages. You'd have to get someone from our corporate finance team. But what I can talk about is the investment that's going into our first commercial facility, which is called Stratos. It's currently being built in the west of Texas, and it's designed to capture up to 500,000 tons of carbon dioxide per year once it's fully up and operational. So if we think about that in terms of scale, the Carbon Engineering's Innovation Center can capture about 1,000 tons per year. This is a big jump
500
up.
times that. Yeah.
It is, which sounds a little bit crazy until you think that, as we look at how that scaling's been done, it's been done in a really thoughtful way. So it's not like everything has gotten 500 times bigger. That would just, as a mechanical engineer, that would just violate all of the things that I was ever taught in terms of good engineering practice. But what we've done is we've taken those units and we've made them a little bit bigger. And then we've connected a bunch of them together in a modular fashion. And that allows us to leverage both the economies of mass manufacturing when you think about all of the front end of our system. So we string a whole bunch of these units together. And then in the back end of our process, where we have to look at bringing things up to higher temperatures and where we need to look at carbon dioxide compression, it allows us to take advantage of economies of scale by using sort of the biggest available commercial units. And this is a project that is over $1 billion of investment. It's attracted major corporate customers. And once it's fully operational, it at present would be the largest direct air capture facility
Wow.
in the world.
This will be bigger than the one in Iceland, Orca, I think.
Yeah, so that one, as far as I understand it, the first one is that's up and operational is 4,000 tons per year, so about 4 times bigger than our innovation center in Squamish. The second one that they're in the process of expanding to is, I believe, 36,000 tons. And so this is just sort of another quantum bigger in terms of that scale for
Wow.
direct air capture. And excitingly, we're not stopping there. At a second site in the US, in the south of Texas, engineering is already underway for another 1.5 DAC technology or DAC facility using carbon engineering's technology. That is expected to capture up to 1 million tons of carbon dioxide per year in a location called the South Texas DAC Hub, which is
Right.
on King Ranch in the US. That site has the potential to enable 30 large scale direct air capture facilities, each capable of removing up to 1 million tons per year
Wow.
once that site is fully built out. So I think it's really exciting that we're planning for scale. And putting that in context, the IATA Net Zero roadmaps projects that we're going to need at least 500 million tons of carbon dioxide removal by 2050. And when we pair direct air capture with secure geologic storage, DAC plays a key role in meeting that demand for high integrity, durable removals that are going to be required to give that one plus negative one that gets us to zero.
Right. So I'm glad you brought in aviation because I was going to add that context. You also have agreements with companies like Airbus and ANA from Japan.
We
How do these
do.
partnerships work, and how do these airlines benefit?
They're absolutely critical. I mean, it's estimated that about 10 to 20% of current global emissions are going to be very difficult, expensive, or even impossible to eliminate at the source. And so we need carbon dioxide removal as a tool to help address those cost effectively. Um, when when we look at those agreements, so Airbus pre-purchased 400,000 tons of carbon removal from 1.5 in 2022. That continues to be one of the largest direct air capture enabled purchases to date. A few months later, Airbus announced their carbon capture offer to allow airlines to participate. To date, we've seen easyJet, Air Canada, and Lufthansa choose to buy 1.5 carbon dioxide removal through Airbus. And then in 2023, All Nippon Airways purchased 30,000 tons of carbon removal credits from 1.5 as a key part of their comprehensive decarbonization strategy. So I think these are really exciting for a couple reasons. First of all, from the perspective of developing a major infrastructure project, it's absolutely critical to have offtake in place as you're building that project to prove that there's demand for the project you're building. That's one of the critical pieces of how you unlock project financing. And from the aviation industry perspective, I think it's a really interesting opportunity to be able to secure carbon removals today that help us to begin investing in growing larger plants, larger investments, and building out that infrastructure that the aviation sector is going to need for net zero. And it helps us to scale that potential future feedstock of atmospheric carbon dioxide that we eventually will be able to use to produce sustainable aviation fuel as well.
Very interesting. Let's if you look away from just the airlines, of course, Airbus and a other airline helps building confidence in the ability to scale. But I believe you've just signed a record deal with Microsoft. Where
Yeah.
does Microsoft come in? Because if you look at Microsoft emissions, my limited knowledge is that their emissions should have been 30% lower than what they were in 2019, but they are now 30% higher. So they urgently need to do something about their growing emissions, primarily thanks to AI. Is that where this is at?
Yeah. So last in when was it? July 2024, 1.5 announced that we'd entered into an agreement with Microsoft to sell 500,000 metric tons of carbon removal over 6 years to support Microsoft's carbon removal strategy. This agreement is the largest single purchase of CDR credits or carbon dioxide removal credits to date that have been enabled by direct air capture technology. And it really highlights the increasing adoption of this climate technology as a solution to help organizations to achieve net zero. When we look at Microsoft's commitments in 2020, they were really bold in coming out and committing to reach net zero very aggressively. And carbon removals played a significant portion of that, particularly for the parts of their emissions that they can't address within their own value chain. And so we're incredibly grateful for their support. And it's really fantastic to see how one of the world's largest corporations is integrating direct air capture into their net zero strategy. We believe the Microsoft agreement sends a really strong message about both the durability and the transparency of direct air capture carbon removal that the aviation industry and others can look to as they build their own carbon removal portfolios.
It's very, very interesting. How does this impact green premium? Because we've not yet addressed the cost of direct air capture. Do deals like Microsoft help reduce the green premium that others may pay for the cost of that?
Absolutely. So I often think about this in terms of an analogy of, when you're making pancakes, your first pancake is never perfect. But if you don't make your first pancake, you can never make your second and your third and your fourth pancake. So Stratos, I would hesitate to call it the first pancake. I think our engineers might get a bit mad at me if I did. But the concept that if you want to start driving down the cost curve, you have to build plant number one first. And having forward-leaning customers who are willing to commit and invest to help you get that first plant over the line is a critical component to the learning by doing. In parallel, we're constantly working on new innovations at Carbon Engineering's Innovation Center, not only working on how we improve our current generation of technology, but also how we work on generation 2 and generation 3 to further drive those costs down. But you can't stress enough the critical importance of building that first project and getting it up and running and all of the learning that's going to come with that.
That's quite amazing. And to be honest, it's very encouraging to see technology companies like Microsoft throwing their weight behind future technologies that will help decarbonize many industries, not just help Microsoft's own carbon footprint. How does carbon removal through DAC compare to other forms of CDR, carbon dioxide removal, like biochar or point source capture, or it's full of short forms and acronyms like BECCS, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. Are you able to shed some light into all of these technologies and how one method is better than the other?
Absolutely. And first of all, I'm not sure if it's engineers or the aviation industry who love acronyms more. We're probably
Oh,
all.
we know we love our acronyms from ACARS to just look at the airport codes.
Exactly. So if you think sort of big umbrella, carbon capture and storage describes a whole suite of solutions that focus on helping us to address the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Within that, point source capture, or what is often traditionally called CCS, describes a technology that's installed at an industrial facility, usually one that's not moving, to capture emissions before they get into the atmosphere. So this is a critical piece of reducing the amount of CO2 emissions that are going into the atmosphere. It's not carbon removal, but it's also critically important. When we think about other forms of carbon removal, there are many other complementary forms of carbon capture that help to remove the carbon dioxide that's already in the atmosphere. We're focused on the development of direct air capture and storage. So that's capturing the carbon dioxide directly from the air. And direct air capture, one of the really interesting things about carbon dioxide is it's almost equivalently or evenly distributed throughout the atmosphere. There's only about a 5 part per million difference in concentration between the poles and the equator. And it mixes very, very quickly. So this flexibility allows hard to decarbonize industries, perhaps where the flue stacks are moving, the point sources are moving around all over the world, to capture an equivalent amount of carbon dioxide from any direct air capture site. So this means that I was at Farnborough earlier in the summer. It means that airplanes that were arriving at Farnborough from anywhere in the world could address their residual emissions through carbon removal credits that are delivered by our 1.5 project in Texas. The atmosphere is a shared resource. Ultimately, we need all of the tools in our toolbox to solve the climate and the energy challenge. Looking at, direct air capture in the context of other removal types, we need an all of the above solution set. But from a direct air capture perspective, DAC is highly scalable. It allows us to pull carbon directly from the atmosphere, where it's an essentially infinite source. It's highly durable. So to achieve true net zero, or we hear academics sometimes calling it geological net zero, scientific reports like the Oxford Principles for Net Zero Aligned Carbon Offsetting advocate for removals that offer long-lived secure storage. And they talk about the need to invest today and scale those up over time. When it's paired with secure geologic storage, direct air capture enables a mechanism for carbon removal that locks away carbon dioxide on geologic timescales. And finally, the measurability piece. You quite literally put a flow meter on your DAC plant and it tells you exactly how many CO2 molecules you've taken out of the air, and you can track that CO2 molecule all the way through to when you put it back underground. So we can measure and account for that carbon dioxide, and we can do that using existing experience, existing industrial precedents, and really importantly, independent standards that make sure that that's done to a really high quality and that it remains high integrity and highly verifiable.
Thank you so much for this 101. I almost feel like we need to release this part as a separate clip of a 101 of all the different technologies. It's always fun to talk to engineers, you see, and you've already worked in the space for such a long time. Let's talk about SAF, or sustainable aviation fuels. Are there plans to integrate DAC, or direct air capture derived sustainable aviation fuel, in your offerings? I believe you were already planning this when it was carbon engineering before the acquisition.
So I actually got to be part of the team at Carbon Engineering that actually produced sustainable aviation fuel from our pilot plant as part of Natural Resources Canada's Sky's the Limit Challenge back in 2021. When we look at our options for producing sustainable aviation fuel, atmospheric carbon dioxide provides a nearly infinite feedstock of carbon dioxide that we pull directly from the atmosphere in the places where it would make sense to both produce SAF or to remove carbon from the air. Today, we're focused on the deployment and development of our direct air capture technology as other critical components of the power to liquids or e-fuels or atmospheric SAF, whatever you want to call it, as those other pieces of the process develop, like the availability and the economics of clean hydrogen. The best thing that we can do today is invest in growing our DAC infrastructure so that when those other pieces of the puzzle are at a point where the economics for making SAF from direct air capture or atmospheric CO2 make sense, that we'll be there and ready with a highly scalable feedstock for future SAF production. Today, direct air capture to sequestration is a necessary complement to SAF, allowing us to address unavoidable residual emissions. Even if we went to 100% SAF, we wouldn't be at net zero. There's still residual emissions from SAF. So it's that complementary two sides of the same coin piece. We're investing in the infrastructure we need to grow that future feedstock for SAF. And it can help us, really interestingly, to accelerate our decarbonization timelines, particularly in regions where SAF is scarce. And then it can help us to reduce our decarbonization costs, because as we build more projects, as we drive down the cost curve, that helps us to do our part to lowering the cost of that future SAF feedstock. So not today, but I would certainly hope that we'll see it sometime in the future.
Glad to hear that you're focusing on the DAC and making sure that that part of the technology is ready. Um, let's talk about regulation. How do you ensure that, regardless of what the regulatory framework is, you are able to accelerate the adoption of direct air capture technology?
So I think if we take a step back and really think about that from the perspective of accelerating the adoption of direct air capture technology, we start at that high level takeaway that DAC removals are an essential complement to sustainable aviation fuel for achieving net zero aviation, not only to counterbalance residual emissions, but also to grow an important future feedstock for sustainable aviation fuel production. So the ability to include removals alongside SAF as complementary tools in aviation policy is a really interesting piece. You know, policy is absolutely essential to ensuring that airlines are on a level playing field, they're experiencing equal terms in terms of access and treatment across markets, and importantly, that we're driving action today that's going to help us to meet those targets in the long term. Removals are already a cost competitive decarbonization pathway for aviation. And so once policy is in place, removals can add flexibility to the complex regulatory space that airlines are facing today. As we engage with policymakers, it's really important to advocate for policies that are performance based. Technology is always going to evolve at a rate faster than regulations can. So we need performance based policies that embody principles like starting low and growing slow, recognizing that we can't go from 0 to 100 today, but we also need to recognize high integrity solutions. So if we think about what that means from an effective policy perspective, you want something that's prescriptive in terms of targeting reductions in emissions, but flexible in the approaches that you use to get there. So that focus on performance-based principles that achieve a true net zero result that can leverage both durable carbon removals and sustainable aviation fuel together as complementary combinations. And one of the speakers at the recent ICAO stock taking made a great comment about the need for us to look at combinations of carrots and sticks together. We need to design policies in such a way that there's enough incentives, those carrots, to drive solutions through development and into deployment at a rate that matches the compliance measures, the sticks that are coming into place. And as a final piece, the atmosphere is a shared resource, and carbon can be removed from anywhere in the world and have the same climate impact. A great example of this is that we now have airlines on 3 continents who've chosen to add 1.5 carbon removal credits to their portfolios, including most recently British Airways. So as we develop a nascent industry, policies that recognize that removals don't necessarily need to be done in your backyard to provide transferable environmental benefits are key. And this can help to broaden access and development potential with the ability to support projects internationally, including in developing countries, which is absolutely critical to ICAO's fundamental principle of no country left behind.
How do you ensure the long-term storage and security of the captured CO2? How is this actually stored? Are these pellets, bricks? How far down do they go? Do they actually pollute the earth or the environment? How do you ensure all of that?
So, caveat first of all, I am not a geologist. I'm a mechanical engineer by training, and we are incredibly lucky to have partnered with our parent company that actually brings over 50 years of carbon management and carbon dioxide injection experience to the table. If I recall correctly, I think they've been putting CO2 underground since 1972. So geologic storage, which is also known as carbon sequestration, is a safe and well-established practice. Each geologic sequestration operation undergoes extensive monitoring, reporting, and verification, In the case of Stratos, that's regulated by the Federal Environmental Protection Agency. And then monitoring, reporting, and verification programs verify that the carbon dioxide injected is being stored safely and securely. It's third-party verification. It ensures transparency and accountability. And our parent company was actually the recipient of the nation's first two U.S. Environmental Protection Agency certified monitoring, reporting, and verification programs for injecting CO2. It's a mouthful. You can understand why they go to acronyms. But to put it in super layman's terms, because I'm not a geologist, when you're putting carbon underground, you're looking for rock with no holes on top of rock with teeny tiny holes. And you compress the carbon until it's a supercritical liquid. So that's a gas that behaves like a liquid. And you inject it deep underground. That's 1 to 3 kilometers, so way below the water table, way below anything that it could have interactions with. And it likes to be there. It first of all gets held there by the rock with no holes, and then it goes into the holes of the rock with the teeny tiny holes. And these are holes that you would almost need a microscope to see, similar
It's
to
like a small sponge.
like a really small sponge. So imagine what happens like if you take a cup of water and you pour it on a sandy beach, and the water sort of absorbs into the beach. Same kind of concept. And then over time, it actually the rocks that are super deep underground are actually a little bit moist. And so the carbon starts to dissolve into the liquids that are down there. And over longer times on geologic timescale, it actually turns back into calcium carbonate, which is the same thing that seashells and limestone are made out of. So not the geologist's version, but it's the sort of mechanical engineer's guide to carbon sequestration.
Thank you. I cannot, there are things you see and then you can't unsee. So I keep thinking about the sponge, and I
Exactly.
love the analogy there. Um, what about source energy? DAC is known to require significant amount of energy. Can you discuss the renewable energy infrastructure needed to power a facility like Stratos?
So we believe that zero or very low emissions power is the foundation for developing direct air capture. And excitingly, it provides an opportunity to build out renewable energy infrastructure in places where it might not otherwise make sense, which is really cool. So we intend, where possible, to power our facilities with low or no carbon energy sources. So, for example, our parent company entered into an agreement to provide zero emission solar power for Stratos. And in the most recent photos of the project, you can actually see the big patch of land immediately next door to the DAC plant that's been cleared for the solar project that's going to be powering Stratos directly. So I think it's really cool that direct air capture creates an opportunity to build out additional new renewable projects that can support our future facilities like the South Texas DAC Hub, which also intends to use solar power for its electricity needs.
What do you think of the argument where lots of environmentalists say that this renewable energy is better sent to other areas rather than aviation and intense needs like DAC?
So there's a tremendous potential for renewable electricity deployment that we haven't even begun to tap. There is Um, and I'm probably going to get this stat wrong, but there's something like enough renewable electricity or energy potential in the form of solar that hits the surface of the world in the course of an hour to power it for a year, if we could capture it. And one of our biggest challenges with building out renewable electricity is getting those green electrons to where we need them most. So there are all sorts of applications that we need to use renewable electricity for. It's really critical that with all of the standards and methodologies that are being developed around direct air capture and carbon removal, they require additionality, new builds of renewables to make sure that you're not draining those green electrons from places that they're already going to do good and valuable work. This is about new builds and really building out that renewable infrastructure So it's, we need all of the above. And this is a critical tool that helps us to accelerate the build out of renewable electricity. Fun fact, there's actually more renewables in Texas now than there are in California. And that's largely because of both the solar and the wind potential in that state. So I think it's really cool that it gives us this opportunity to build out more renewables, not think about it in terms of taking renewables from one place and putting them somewhere else. It's a more, and we're making a bigger pie, not dividing that pie up.
That's a fun fact about Texas. Here's another fun fact. Texas, in the last 12 months, has installed more solar panels than Canada has in its history.
Well, Canada really needs to get a move on, doesn't it?
Since you're speaking to a former Whistler, right, and I'm speaking to someone who lives in the same area, I think it's something we can relate to. But Texas is really going big on this.
Absolutely. Well, my parents have solar panels on their house, but that's about all I could directly influence. But I think it would be fantastic to see us, leveraging that. And I love those tidbits.
Yeah, indeed. Final couple of questions, Anna. This has been a really good conversation. Can you share any insights on the local impact of projects like Stratos? Impact on jobs and economic benefits that these projects bring to the local communities.
We work really closely with various community stakeholders in the areas where we operate to ensure that benefits from our project flow back to the local community. So, for example, we've developed partnerships with educational institutions, workforce development organizations, environmental advocacy groups. DAC projects use many of the same skills that exist today in the energy industry, which creates an opportunity to leverage existing workforces and create new job opportunities. To give you one case study for Stratos, the project's expected to employ more than 1,000 people during the construction phase and up to 120 full-time once operational.
And I'm hoping these are new skills to be developed that stay in the community for much longer, and they have cross, industry application as well. So these are core engineering skills that you're building, not just some administrative work, right?
Exactly. Core engineering skills, operation skills. There was a really cool post recently about how our team has supported the build out of a STEM center and a Boys and Girls Club in Texas that's helping an underprivileged community. They've got this massive Lego table. And as a kid who loved to play with Lego, I just thought that that was one of the coolest things in terms of really thinking forward about how do you build that future workforce.
Very, very interesting, for sure. Finally, let's talk about your parent, Oxy. Oxy is an oil producer, and there is DAC, which has brought out all skeptics. So you've just been bought by an oil major. How do you address skeptics who highlight the fact that you're owned by Oxy?
So we need the expertise and the capability to securely and safely store billions of tons of carbon dioxide underground. We are going to need players at the table from the energy industry that have been doing it for decades. It doesn't make sense to say, okay, we're going to start with a completely blank page and none of that experience. Oxy brings decades of chemical industry, carbon management, and large scale infrastructure project delivery expertise that's absolutely necessary for us to commercialize direct air capture. Oxy is already an industry leader in safe and secure storage of carbon dioxide, and they already store up to 20 million tons of carbon dioxide each year. And they've been doing it for over 50 years. So today, Oxy has existing infrastructure and suitable sites in the US to store billions of tons of carbon dioxide underground. Oxy was also the first US oil and gas company to establish goals for net zero that align with the Paris Agreement. They are committed and have a strategy that's rooted in their core competence of managing carbon dioxide to further climate solutions that the world needs. So prior to my role with 1.5, I spent nearly a decade with Carbonate Engineering, who's developing the DAC technology that's being deployed by 1.5 and Oxy. That's a partnership that's already existed for half a decade. It's a critical piece of driving carbon engineering's technology through development and into commercial deployment. I actually think it's a really positive thing.
I hear you, and I agree. You are looking to scale, so why not work with someone who has a lot more engineering expertise in scaling large engineering projects? So I hear you on that. This is very exciting, and thank you for diving deep into direct air capture and how this relates to aviation. The final part, Anna, of this interview is something more personal. We call it the rapid fire round, in which we and the listeners get to know you a bit more personally. So I'll start with something very simple, like what's your favorite airline?
Oh, that's a tough one. Can I say any airline with a net zero plan that includes permanent carbon
No,
removals?
no, you can't. What's your favorite
I
airline?
mean, as a Canadian, I will always have a place in my heart for Air Canada, not only because they have the most flights out of Vancouver, but also they invested in the Carbon Engineering Innovation Center in 2022 and have bought carbon removal. And also for All Nippon Airways, because they were the first airline to buy direct air capture and sequestration carbon removal directly from 1.5.
Fantastic answer. There you go. Now we're talking. How about your favorite airport?
My favorite airport is hands down YVR. Vancouver, for anybody who doesn't live, eat, and breathe airport acronyms. There's something about walking through YVR, seeing all of the First Nations artifacts, all of the nods in the architecture to the West Coast environment, the fact that the beams look like trees. When I, smell the waterfall in the customs area and see the aquarium display of the jellyfish, that's when I know I'm home.
Wow, I love this. Yes, aquarium makes complete sense, and I relate to what you're talking about, given that we share a same home airport for the listeners here. What is your favorite book?
I've got a couple.
Okay.
First one, The Citizen's Guide to Climate Success by Professor Mark Jackard, who's a professor from Simon Fraser University here in Vancouver. He's also currently the chair for the BC Utilities Commission. And it does the best job of any book I've ever read of making climate policy accessible to the general public. And it's a really easily readable book. I absolutely love it. Recommend it to anyone who's starting to think about what kind of climate policies, how do you design climate policies effectively? And then the second one is the entire series of the Ada Twist and Rosie Revere kids books. My daughters absolutely love them. And I think they do such an incredible job of highlighting the opportunity for careers in science and technology and engineering and math for little kids and showing them in a really diverse way. I was really lucky. I grew up in a household where my mom was an engineer as well as my dad. I thought everybody's mom knew how to fix the toaster. And my mom's college roommate was an astronaut. When I was thinking about what could I be when I grew up, there was no concept that there could be limitations. But so many kids out there, you can't be what you can't see. And if you don't grow up in that kind of an environment, having books like this that can take those concepts and make them really accessible to you, whether you're a little girl or a kid who's, a person of color or underprivileged or any of those things, I absolutely love how they bring the concepts of curiosity and innovation and trying, and that it's okay to fail, and some of those core principles that are so necessary for any career in science or engineering or probably aviation. They're my absolute favorites, and my girls adore them.
Fantastic. My girls love Ada Twist as well, so I know what you're talking about. I know exactly what you're talking about. What do you do in your free time, Anna?
I hang out with my kids. I've got two daughters. I spend as much time as I can on the water in a sailboat. I also play field hockey.
Oh, wow. Okay. That was.
I don't like to sit still.
Okay. Sounds good. That was a surprise I was not expecting, but we always learn something new. What is something you'd like to learn?
I couldn't even begin to create a short list. I think that the moment that you stop learning, That's it. Curiosity is
Game
just such
over.
a fundamental, yeah, you need to always keep learning. There are always new things to learn. So my list of things I want to learn is endless.
Okay. Amen to that. um, what is the best advice you received?
It doesn't matter what you think you said. It matters what the other person thinks they heard.
Oh, interesting. This is new because I've heard what matters is how you made them feel, but what the other
Oh,
person.
okay. Maybe it's
There
a
you go.
combination of both.
There you go. It's how you made them feel that they remember for a long time, not necessarily what you said.
Hmm.
There you go. Final question. If we are speaking 1 year from now and we are popping champagne, what are we celebrating?
Bringing Stratos online.
Okay, fantastic. Let us hope we can actually do that and pop some champagne in a year from
That
now.
would be fabulous.
Anna, thank you for geeking out with me. This was a pleasure. It was a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you so much.
A pleasure as well. Thank you so much, Shashank.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Sustainability in the Air. Aviation is one of the hardest to decarbonize industries, yet there are multiple paths to get to net zero. Awareness is key to a green future. So please give us your support to help our sustainable aviation insights reach a wider audience. You can do this by sharing this episode on your network, on LinkedIn, Twitter, or even WhatsApp. Or perhaps you might consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to this episode. You can start a conversation with us by writing to us at podcast@simplifying, that's simply with an i.com. And for more content on sustainable aviation, please visit our website green.simplifying.com and join the movement. Sustainability in the Air is an original podcast by Simplifying. The show is produced by Juraj Toth in Slovakia. Dirk Singer is our Director of Sustainability, who leads research for each interviewee out of Greenwich, UK. Shubhadeep Pau is our Supervising Editor based out of Mumbai and Singapore. The articles are written by Ayushi Badola in Dehradun in India and Mira Hull in Montreal, Quebec. Creative design is led by Ligia Esteve in Montreal. Baiba Drimen is the project director for the show based out of Valencia, Spain. Special thanks to Wendy Sim in Singapore. And I'm Shashank Nigam, the CEO of Simplifying and your host. Please feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn.